Did that work, Manuela? Can you all see that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Oh, good.
We have 11 participants here. I'm not sure if you or Sarah can see who accepted the meeting to see if we have critical crowd.
Give me just a second, Manuela, and I can look.
Sounds
I
good.
think we are probably pretty close to our folks that accepted the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, we're at about 70% of the folks that accepted the meeting invite.
Okay.
So we can wait a couple more minutes or we can get started if we're ready.
Let me see. Can everybody share their video? I wanted the consultants to be able to see the audience when they're presenting. All right. Thank you so much. I think you can get started.
All right, give me just a second to share my screen again. Good morning, everyone. Great to be back with you virtually. So this morning, we're going to be going through our presentation on the state of the corridor. So essentially summarizing all the background work that we've done to date for you all as a steering committee. A shorter version of this presentation will be given in the next few weeks to City Commission, Planning Commission, and the DDA. So as part of this, we'll take a couple of minutes to kind of pause and answer questions as we walk through. In the meantime, if you do have a question, feel free to just put it in the chat, and then we'll stop and address that when we get to that point in time. So really quickly, this is our agenda. We're going to walk through each of these 8 items, then we'll have a time for any public comment at the end. So to start, we certainly began by looking at the work that's been done on the corridor in the past. And I think as we mentioned to you all when we were with you a few weeks back, certainly this is not the first plan or effort that's focused on Mission Street and Mount Pleasant. So one of those key plans that we talked about in the past is the recent master plan that was completed in 2020. And so a lot of that plan is focused on Mission Street. And it envisions the street as a regional center that complements downtown. It recommends really significant changes in development pattern. This graphic on the right-hand side of this slide shows that vision for Mission Street in 2050. One of the things that we've heard a lot during this process so far is that while this vision is aspirational, and it's not to say that in 50 years we couldn't see a vision that looked like this, the process between getting from where we are today to what that looks like in the future isn't very clear. And so as we're walking through this plan update and thinking about the Mission Street Improvement Plan, really thinking about what are those phases of development and how to, what's the next stage and the stage after that versus just thinking about final state is really important. Another important plan is the area non-motorized plan. This was completed in 2011. It recommends a variety of bike and pedestrian improvements. Many of them have been made since that plan. But one of the things it really emphasizes is rather than making Mission Street that bike or pedestrian travel area is actually looking at alternatives to Mission Street. So essentially traveling around it versus using it as that north-south corridor. There are pros and cons to that approach. And so one of the things that we'll really be focusing on as we work through this project is, what are the options for being able to provide effective non-motorized transportation on Mission versus looking at alternatives off that provide the same opportunities. The city adopted a complete streets policy in 2015. That policy requires the city to develop and implement standards for complete streets with the goal of creating a complete streets network throughout the city. Much of that policy emphasis is accomplished through the city's current zoning ordinance. The city's current zoning ordinance has specific standards for types of streets and how they're designed and developed. And so the city's made great progress in working toward this policy already. And as we're doing this plan update, we'll be thinking about how to ensure that our plans for Mission Street align with those standards in the zoning ordinance. Today, Mission Street doesn't quite fit with what the zoning ordinance prescribes. And so we'll be thinking about how to be sure those two things align effectively. There are a variety of other plans that are relevant that we've reviewed as part of this work, just to be sure that we've got that necessary background and we're doing work that's consistent with the work that's been done in the past. One of those is an access management plan from 2008. We like to point this out because those of you that were on our walking audit that did the southern portion of the corridor with me and Chris, we walked this interchange, so this intersection. This is Bluegrass and Mission Street. And you'll see if you look at some of those little yellow boxes there that point out things that identifies issues like driveways being too closely spaced, a need for internal connections between businesses. Those were all the same things we talked about as a group when we walked that section of the corridor. So while there are improvements that need to be made, a lot of the work that we're identifying here, we're not talking about new ideas. We're talking about pursuing and sort of finding ways to implement concepts and needs that have been around for a long time. So in addition to looking at previous plans that have been done, we've also done an analysis of demographic changes. As part of our scope of work, we'll be updating the demographic analysis section of the city's master plan. And when we did this, we really were given some pretty clear direction from staff, and as part of our direction, the conversation at our last steering committee meeting about looking at certain topics. One of those topics is population change and the impacts of enrollment at Central Michigan. So, as you all, I'm sure, are pretty well aware, population in Mount Pleasant has declined over the last 10 years. So this slide shows change in population as a percent of total population in two 10-year time periods between 2000 and 2010, and then 2010 to 2020. So you can see here that over the last 10 years, or during the period from 2010 to 2020, Mount Pleasant dropped by about 16% in total population, which translates to 4,179 people. You can see Union Township also declined, Isabella County declined as a whole, and the state of Michigan essentially held about flat. Over that same time period, enrollment at Central Michigan actually decreased by quite a bit more. And so this graph shows enrollment at CMU based on the information provided on Central's website. And so during that, roughly that same period of time between 2014 and 2023, total enrollment at Central's main campus decreased by about 8,800 students. And you can see in the sort of text here on the left in terms of how the US Census counts students, that students are supposed to be counted as regular residents. You're included as a resident in the place where you sleep most of the time. So for those students that are on campus or living in housing within the city, they should be counted within the city's total population. And so while the city's dropped in terms of population, about 4,200 people, we haven't lost nearly the number of people that you would expect if all that was happening was a decline in student enrollment. And so this chart, I know it's a bit confusing, but this chart kind of shows the change in population across different age brackets in the city of Mount Pleasant. And so what this shows is you see a decrease in the number of people in that college age range, late teens, early 20s, as we would expect, but then increases in some other age brackets. If all that was happening in the city was a decline in population or a decline in student enrollment, we'd expect these other age brackets to remain relatively the same or see general sort of aging of the population like we're seeing across the state of Michigan right now, and that's not the dynamic. So while there's been a decrease in population in that sort of college age range, there's been an increase in population in what we kind of call the family formation years, people between 30 and 45. There's been a subsequent drop in population for folks in their 50s, and then a bit of an uptick in population for people in retirement age or early retirement age, 65 to 75. We can't tell you why this is happening necessarily, but it's an important trend to think about. I think as we've done this work, one of the prevailing themes has been this feeling of, sort of negative feelings about the change in enrollment at CMU. And what we see in this as we look at it is that's not the whole story to tell. There's something else going on where the city is actually seeing an influx population from folks in that kind of early family age and also retirees that may provide some new opportunities as you think about development and growth down the road and how Mission Street supports those populations versus maybe the student population that it's historically been designed for, at least Southern Mission Street. At the same time, we looked at income. And so this chart shows income distribution in the city compared to Union Township, the state, the county as a whole across different brackets. So left to right, lower income households being in red, and then higher income households being in black. So Mount Pleasant, just when we look at regular income distribution, about 30% of the population or households earn less than $20,000 a year. But a big chunk of those households are accounted for by students who, by definition, can't earn a lot of money because they're enrolled in classes most of the time. So based on the census where that same information comes from around housing distribution, we can see that there are 4,200 students that live in college or student housing. So they're in dorms or housing that's associated with the university or another college in Mount Pleasant. And so that creates kind of an inverse distribution between family households and non-family households, which is the chart in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. So you can see there in Mount Pleasant, there are significantly more non-family households than family households, and that relationship is flipped in the state as a whole. And so if we take that same income distribution and we remove about 1,000, just as sort of a thought experiment. If we remove 1,000 of those student low-income households from our income bracket, our income distribution, you can see Mount Pleasant's income distribution actually looks a lot more like the states as a whole than it does communities that commonly would be thought of as being sort of low income or communities that have challenges with poverty or other issues. So that, again, when we think about the city and how it develops and its impacts and how its demographic characteristics impacted it, you all have some very unique characteristics because such a large portion of your population is made up by students. And so just looking at population trends and income distribution without accounting for those students can be a little bit misleading. The next demographic item we looked at is employment. As you all probably know, Mount Pleasant's a regional employment center for your area. So there are about 14,000 jobs in the city. Of those, about 12,000 people come into the city for work every day. And then about 4,500 leave for work, and 2,000 people live and work within the city of Mount Pleasant in a given day. And so this sort of dynamic of people coming into the city to work, living in the city and working in the city and then leaving isn't spread equally across kinds of industries. So this chart just shows the total number of workers and jobs in the city across different industries. And you can see the two industries here kind of highlighted with the red box. Educational services being the college and university, healthcare and social assistance, primarily driven by the hospital. You can see that there are many more people come to work in Mount Pleasant every day than work in those industries. And when we look at it as a percentage of total, they have sort of a larger share of percentage than people that work in Mount Pleasant. So in other words, a larger proportion of people that come to work in Mount Pleasant work in educational services and healthcare than people that live in Mount Pleasant and work in those industries. So there's a bit of a mismatch there that might provide opportunities either for, providing employment opportunities for folks that live in Mount Pleasant, or trying to encourage folks in those industries to make Mount Pleasant maybe their long-term home instead of a place they commute to. And so that leads us into housing. You may or may not have seen this graphic. This has been a very hot topic for those of us in community development planning work now for the last decade or so. The key thing to know here is that in Michigan, generally, we've built a lot of the housing in sort of the white gray colors on the right and left-hand sides of the slide. So we have a lot of single-family detached homes, and we have a lot of large apartment buildings. We have very little of the stuff in between when we think about the state as a whole. And that's a challenge as we have an aging population, and we have folks that are choosing to have children later, or smaller households that actually are looking for some of that stuff in the middle that we just don't have much of. But in Mount Pleasant, you do. So what this slide shows is the state of Michigan, over 70% of all of the housing units in Michigan are single family detached structures. So your typical single family house with a yard. In Mount Pleasant, that number is about 40%. And so you can see, again, the red box here that highlights units in that missing middle category. You have significantly more housing units in that missing middle structure, that missing middle piece between 3 units and 20 units in a structure than the state as a whole. Again, there's sort of history there around trying to provide options for student housing. But this may also provide an opportunity to think about repurposing that housing for some of those populations that you are seeing increases in. This kind of goes beyond our scope around Mission Street, but as we think about opportunities for redevelopment along Mission Street, providing for repurposing some of this housing to meet the needs of those populations you have moving in the city may present a great opportunity. The State of Michigan Housing Development Authority, that's the MISHDA acronym there at the top, did analysis for all of the regions across the state in 2022 based on 2021 data to identify gaps in housing units. So essentially, if you built these units, people would fill them. And so we pulled that information to compare Mount Pleasant's to Midlands. There's 3 different market segments in Midlands, just as an illustration, that there is demand for housing. Certainly that rental housing may be a little bit skewed given the change in student enrollment. But you can see there also a pretty substantial demand for owner-occupied units that isn't currently being met. And so again, there are opportunities in Mount Pleasant for new development or for repurposing existing housings to meet that population need that's there today, irrespective of the fact that you may be seeing declining enrollment at CMU. This is an index of home value. So, how does home value stack up in Mount Pleasant, again, compared to Midland, kind of your closest major metro? And while your total home value is slipping a little bit compared to Midland, you're largely holding your own, which for a community that's lost 20,000 people, another community in Michigan that's 20,000 people in that decade is Flint. Flint's home value price would not look like this if we compared it to Midland's. So there are real opportunities in Mount Pleasant. You're kind of holding value despite this decline in student enrollment. It's not just a very simple story around decline in Mount Pleasant, as we see in some other Michigan cities that might be struggling with population decline. This graph shows total vacancy. You can see an uptick in vacancy around COVID, right, 2020, and then that number's come back down to kind of historic vacancy levels. And so you're back down to a vacancy level that's similar to what it was in 2012 with a very different housing market, right? Our housing market today certainly has a lot more demand and prices are much, much higher than they were in 2012. And that's shown in rent costs. So rent costs in Mount Pleasant have risen substantially, as they have everywhere in the last few years, especially since COVID. And so this creates issues certainly for folks in finding affordable, attainable housing, but also opportunities as we think about potential new development. That is a lot around demographics. We recognize that. I know we've got kind of limited time this morning, so I can pause for a minute if anybody has any questions or comments or items you'd like to discuss related to that demographic analysis. Going once, going twice. Hearing none. All right, we'll go ahead and keep going. If anybody has questions, do feel free to put them in the chat. Just as a recap on our walking audit and strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges analysis, hopefully some of you see yourselves in those pictures there. So we did a walking audit of the northern section of Mission Street and the southern section. This slide shows the results of that walking audit with an example of one of our checklists there on the right-hand side. You can see that the audit, while it was similar in terms of safety and appeal, so the yellow bars in this graph are no answers to that audit. In other words, a negative response as we're thinking about that element, and the blue are positive responses or yeses. You can see that for safety and appeal, overwhelmingly, we had negative responses in both areas, right? That overall safety, sort of curb appeal, opportunities to make the appearance or the experience more pleasurable as a pedestrian are lacking. In the northern section, I know folks talked a lot about the proximity of the sidewalk to the roadway, that you're walking kind of right next to traffic. But then we have some differences, right? So in that northern section, we actually had a lot of positive responses about the sidewalk itself. So the sidewalk is in relatively good condition. It's relatively safe to walk. And you can make that movement fairly easily compared to the southern section where responses weren't nearly as positive. The sidewalk in the southern section is much more fragmented. It has some challenges in terms of broken areas and parking lots and other things. But then streets and crossings in the southern section actually were much better. And that reflects kind of the newness of those intersections. There were some intersections in that southern section that have recently been done, have new signage, new signaling. And so overall, that crossing experience felt better in the southern section than in the northern section of the corridor. And so when we all did that sticky note exercise together, this slide just summarizes the frequency of topics that came up across the 4 topic areas: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Safety, by far the #1 most common topic, not even close. After that, the 4 topics that came up, most commonly were accessibility, opportunities for redevelopment, and traffic, or the 3, sorry. And then you can see kind of the drop off in other frequency of topics that came as a result of that work. So as we expected, as we talked about when we began, this will continue, that our emphasis throughout this project is safety #1, how to make the corridor more safe for all users, but also then thinking about some of those other comments that came up about, if we are reducing traffic, what's the impact of that on local businesses? And how do we be sure to mitigate that impact and manage for it? And so these are some of those topics that came up when we analyzed the strengths and weaknesses, kind of aligned with one another. So one of the strengths of the corridor is access and location, right? Some weaknesses then are the challenges in navigating it as a pedestrian or a bicyclist. Traffic volume is a strength, certainly provides opportunities for businesses, but the other side of that coin is it's hard to make left turns, and crossing the street can be pretty hazardous. And so you can see kind of how these strengths and weaknesses line up with one another in many cases. So we have a great business-friendly diversity of businesses in the corridor, but we've got a lot of driveways. And so thinking about how to manage some of those strengths and the things we want to maintain while also being sure that we don't create corresponding challenges will be part of our work. And then looking into the future, so strengths and weaknesses being today, opportunities and challenges being, in the future and tomorrow. These are those topics that came up. So wanting to improve safety and access, but balancing traffic flow. Opportunities for redevelopment and placemaking, but understanding our reality today. This kind of gets back to that master plan graphic. So we have great opportunities, but we've got some challenges and constraints in history that we need to be mindful of. Lots of opportunities to close driveways and improve access so that one business doesn't need 3 driveways. Can we do with 1? Because that, cuts our number of conflicts with the pedestrian walking on sidewalks down. But there's a cost associated with that. And so how do we provide for those issues? And then some other challenges and opportunities that didn't really line up with each other, but were important on their own, were things like enhancing landscaping, lighting, looking at technology to improve safety, and also managing some of those challenges we've already talked about. Changes in population, existing city policies, and generally just coming to consensus around updates and changes to the corridor. And that's part of our work throughout this process together, is to take the information in and come to consensus on those things that we feel like are good, sort of common sense, high quality improvements to the corridor that we all can agree on. So that takes us down to the physical conditions of the corridor, and I'll let Matt talk through that.
Good morning. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about both the existing conditions, so the layout and configuration of the roadway as it is today, some of the traffic and crash data that we've gone through and analyzed, and then some of the previous work that the state at the Michigan Department of Transportation, or what we'll call MDOT, as you all are likely aware throughout this presentation, has been doing previously, and both kind of in conjunction with our project here. So generally speaking, and this came up a lot in our walking audit, and I'm sure it's familiar to those of you that use the Mission Street corridor, on a daily or frequent basis. Some general high-level takeaways are that the sidewalks in the northern portion of the corridor are more pleasant and less interrupted than the southern portion. There's less driveways and curb cut access, across those sidewalks. But to Jason's point, they are in some places adjacent to the curb. So when you're walking, you're right next to traffic, and that's uncomfortable and can be unsafe. And there's minimal opportunities for safe crossing. So although there may be curb cuts to be ADA or wheelchair accessible, you still have to cross 5 lanes of traffic without any physical protection or traffic control at those spaces. Kind of in that same vein, accessibility for wheelchairs, strollers, and people that have difficulty moving around is a challenge. So that gets to a lot of the sidewalk location, the placement, some of the ramps, and the way they kind of curve down into the road. Things like broken or cracked sidewalks, potholes, and driveways. It's just tricky generally to get around if you cannot walk very well. In general, the access management or the utilization of driveways and their placement is better with new development. The older development would require some significant retrofits kind of behind the sidewalk to allow for shared access between properties, to then mitigate kind of some of that direct access to Mission and promote some of the safety benefits, both for people driving and for people walking in or biking along the corridor. Generally speaking, most businesses are maintained and demonstrate, thoughtful and careful investment, I think, from the property owners, which is a great sign. We don't see, signs of property or, decay or deterioration so much as exists on some similar corridors and other locations across the state. And finally, opportunities to add landscaping and overall just soften the environment are plentiful. We have a lot of fair bit of right of way to work with in some cases, and some opportunities just to kind of green the street. With regards to the right of way, and this is kind of the piece that has come up both with MDOT's previous plan as well as some of the concepts proposed in the master plan, is that we're not working with the same kind of available space along the corridor. So the right of way along Mission changes as you go south to north or north to south. We essentially have more room in the south between Bluegrass and Preston. And then as we go north of Preston, the available right of way or the space that the state, the city can make investments in and kind of modify changes. It tightens up a little bit. So generally speaking, there's more landscaping, kind of wider sidewalks in the southern section and just more room kind of behind the curb. But then businesses are very set back. There's large frontage parking lots. The northern section feels a little bit tighter. Those sidewalks are a bit closer into the businesses. There's a little less kind of frontage parking. It's just a little narrower, and the traffic volumes also reflect that. We'll get to that in just a minute. But the traffic volumes are not static along the entire corridor. They're generally speaking higher in the southern section and lower in the northern section. That kind of correlates generally just how the street feels. So as far as the historical traffic data along Mission goes, this is just one kind of data point. So traffic counts taken at one location over time. We've seen a historical decrease in vehicular volume along Mission Street. So back in 2001, volumes were significantly higher, something in the neighborhood of 35,000 or so vehicles per day. Today in 2023, they were around 21,000. So there is, I think as Jason kind of mentioned, certainly some correlation there between decreases in student enrollment at CMU and then therefore corresponding decreases in vehicle volume on Mission. But that's not quite the whole story. So we're seeing relatively minimal or stagnant fluctuations in traffic volumes between 2015 and 2023, but we're still generally seeing kind of a bit of a downward trend. So the past few years it's been oscillating just a bit, but generally speaking, volumes have been decreasing over time. The crash and safety analysis, we just looked at, high level crashes that occurred along Mission Street for the last 5 years of data that we have kind of publicly available. So that's between 2018 and 2022. During those 5 years, there were over 1,000 crashes that occurred along Mission, only between Bluegrass and Pickard. And generally speaking, crash frequency, or just the pure number of crashes that occurred, is higher at the southern end of the corridor and concentrated kind of at that signalized intersection with Broomfield Road, Broomfield Street. And again, crash frequency kind of tends to correlate with traffic volumes as well. So generally speaking, where we have higher traffic volumes at the southern end, we see higher, essentially, number of crashes. As far as the types of crashes that we're seeing, and this is kind of to be expected with a street that looks and feels like Mission, rear end crashes at intersections are the most common type of vehicle crashes along the corridor. So again, that's someone, waiting, stopped at a light, someone is, coming about behind them too fast, not paying attention, and rear ends them. Those crashes are frequent, but they're generally not dangerous as so much. The next two most prevalent types of crashes are angle and sideswipe crashes. And of those angle crashes, or where someone, kind of swerves into a lane next to you or even runs off the road, those tend to result in more severe crash outcomes. So whether that's an injury or unfortunately even fatalities. And again, generally speaking, as is to be expected, crash frequencies are higher during the academic year. So we see a decrease in crash numbers during the summer, and then that picks back up when CMU is, back in session during the fall and the winter and spring months. And that also is essentially correlates with just an increase in traffic volumes. So more traffic is more chances for crashes to happen, and that's roughly what we're seeing. One important point that we really like to focus on, kind of from the state level on down to our kind of mission as a, we'll say, traffic engineering consultant, is a focus on what are known as vulnerable road users. So this is anyone that is using a road that doesn't have the protection of a motor vehicle. That could be someone walking, someone biking, someone on a motorcycle. But generally speaking, this is true on Mission and is true on streets like this all across the state, that these vulnerable road users are disproportionately represented in crashes that resulted in a significant injury. So of all the crashes between 2018 and 2022 that happened on Mission, only about 2% involved a pedestrian or a bicyclist. But when we filter that to look at crashes that resulted in either a severe injury or fatality, those 33% of crashes involved a pedestrian or bicyclist. So there's an outsized number, of crashes that result in a severe injury that involve essentially someone outside of a car. And that's kind of just common sense. When you think about it, that, a vehicle striking someone without protection is generally more likely to result in a severe injury than, a vehicle striking their vehicle. And one other important thing that we found, or one other important thing to note, is that every single crash in the last 5 years that we have available that involved a pedestrian resulted in an injury to the pedestrian, and 63% of crashes involving a bicyclist resulted in an injury to that bicyclist. Only about 10% of crashes that only involve vehicles resulted in an injury. So again, as we look at conceptual redesigns and a focus on safety, and very important to note, as again could be expected, but we're seeing significantly more adverse safety outcomes for pedestrians or bicyclists, or again what we call vulnerable road users that are involved in crashes along the corridor. So anything we can do to mitigate their exposure and or kind of the vehicle speed at impact, because crashes do occur, is certainly a welcome improvement. Finally, we performed what's called a crash rate analysis. So these numbers in the table on the right do have a unit, but generally speaking, they're perhaps best seen as a comparison between different types of streets. So a crash rate analysis controls for the traffic volume on a street as well as how long a segment is, to kind of give a general idea of how frequent crashes have been occurring on different types of roads. So the total crash rate, the number on the left there, is kind of a comparison of different types of streets and how often just all types of crashes are occurring on those roads. So just to back up, there's a lot going on here. But we looked at 5 different streets in the Mount Pleasant area. Mission and Pickard are what are technically classified as urban arterials, but have 5 lanes, with a center turn lane, a lot of driveways, a lot of access, but also high vehicle speeds. US 127 is a highway. It's hard to get on. There's only certain designated access points, and it's hard to get off. You can't just turn right to a business, right up the road. You have to go up to a ramp, that kind of thing. And there's generally no pedestrians or bicyclists, allowed on those types of roads. And then the flip side of that coin is Broadway and Main Street, or your what feels like a Main Street downtown area, where vehicle speed is de-emphasized and vehicle access is prioritized. So speeds are lower, but it's easier to get places, and it's also a lot more comfortable for someone to be walking and biking, along those streets. So as is again true on streets like this, state and nationwide, Mission and Pickard exhibit the worst severe and fatal crash rates out of all 5 of the streets that we analyzed. And that's generally speaking because we are trying to mix vehicle speed and vehicle access, as well as allowing for other people outside cars to also use, the sidewalk, the shoulder, whatever that is. And when that mix kind of occurs, when we try and combine speed, access, and also throw pedestrians and bicyclists into that mix, we generally speaking see adverse safety outcomes. And that's what we're seeing on Mission and Pickard. So generally speaking, severe and fatal crashes are more likely to occur on those 2 streets than the other 3 streets in the Mount Pleasant area analyzed. And finally, going to wrap up with just a brief overview of the MDOT modeling work that's been going on, kind of previously as well as in the background on this project. So they've completed preliminary traffic analysis for a handful of different roadway configurations. As most of y'all are likely aware, there was a boulevard conversion that was initially proposed back in 2008, but was voted down by the city primarily due to right-of-way concerns. So the design is kind of in the top right of the slide. It's a little tricky to see properties in right-of-way, but generally speaking, the median in the boulevard conversion was big. It would result in some right-of-way takes, some acquisitions from private property owners, and would again promote kind of higher vehicle speeds. And that it just felt a bit too large, I think, for the context and development that's happening around it. The master plan completed a few years ago calls for landscaping improvements, median implementation, one more thing along Mission. So we're looking to include some of those elements, as appropriate and where feasible in any conceptual redesigns. And as MDOT has kind of brought up before, there's some growing acceptance of flexibility in design standards, whether it has to do with how speed limits are set, how wide a lane needs to be, where landscaping can go kind of into the long road, where lighting can go, if things like street furniture are allowed, all that sort of stuff that can help to soften and enhance, the corridor. There's been some growing recognition of their both feasibility, but also potential to promote like vibrancy in an area, even on a street road or a state road, like Mission. So MDOT has performed some modeling to understand the impacts to operations for vehicles under various roadway configurations. They've tested both a boulevard and a roundabout concept. So a boulevard would essentially implement the Michigan left procedure, where you'd be restricted from turning lefts, at most driveways along the road. And at intersections, you have to go past, do a U-turn and then make a right turn instead. As well as roundabouts, where again, they would just convert most major intersections to roundabouts. Both concepts were found to reduce intersection delay, or how long someone is sitting, stopped at a light under estimated future traffic conditions. And boulevard modification is estimated to slightly increase vehicle speeds. So if you think about it, generally speaking, when there's less places to turn, there's more, or there's also less people that are, turning out or turning in and accelerating. So speeds are generally a little bit more consistent. And because of that, they tend to tick up just a little bit. And the replacement of the existing layout, so just putting it back as is estimated to slightly decrease vehicle speeds. Again, that's assuming traffic volumes will continue to increase in the future. And if we do nothing, we just replace the 5-lane cross-section as is today. As traffic volumes are expected to grow, or projected to by the state, that will also, slightly increase congestion in the future, leading to some minor delay impacts. Yeah, and I think I'll kick it back to Jason to quickly run through the survey results that we've been hearing.
Thanks, Matt. Before we move on, any questions about the demographic or the two sections we just walked through, the physical design and sort of the work that's been done?
There is one question here in the chat from Doug LaBelle. How many fatalities have occurred on Mission and Pickard in your analysis?
So I can circle back with the exact numbers. I believe off the top of my head, the number of fatalities, at least in the years that we had available, was 0 for both. But there were a significant amount of what we call severe or type A crashes. And those are kind of crashes that result in a significant injury to someone in it, like a broken arm or a leg. But yeah, happy to circle back with that exact number.
And again, I just remind that our analysis was for 18 to 22. And so I think there have been some fatalities that have occurred recently that aren't caught in that window.
Yep.
Right, I was going to add that we had a pedestrian last year on Mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the only one that I'm aware of. I was just curious if there were additional, because it's referenced in the analysis that that it's extremely high compared to surrounding areas of severe and fatality. So I think it'd be important to decipher between those two, because to my knowledge, there's only been the one fatality, and I'm just curious on how many we're calculating in this analysis. And if it's 0, then at that point I would make mention of that and not just brush over it like there's actually a lot of fatalities, because that's the way it's presented.
Well, I mean, I'd say we're presenting severe crashes, right? So if there's an injury or a fatality, so we don't tend to try to break those two out. We can, if you think that's appropriate. I think the key thing there is that applies to those other roads too. I don't know if there have been fatalities on those, but we can certainly provide that information too.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important aspect when we're addressing safety. Again, that's just my opinion. I think breaking those out on severe crashes versus fatalities, I think is a very, very important thing to do. But I'm not a safety expert. That's just my opinion as a developer in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks so much. Typical, we'll say, state procedure is to lump the two together, but we're happy to split those out. I think, again, off the top of my head, the short answer is that the number of fatalities on any of those 5 streets for the 5 years that I can look at is 0 on all of them. But again, that has obviously changed in 23 and 24, the 2 years that I don't have access to and did not quite get caught in that, that data.
Any other questions or comments from anybody? Okay, we'll go ahead and just walk through briefly the survey results. There is a full summary of the survey results available on the city's website. If you want to dive into more information from this, if anybody's interested in more detail on these, please feel free to reach out to myself or Sarah, and we can share more information with you if you're curious. Overall, response was great. We had almost 1,500 responses, complete responses to the survey. About 70% of those were Mount Pleasant residents, and you can see the rest, about 16% visitors to Mission Street, 14% students, and 8% employees of businesses along the corridor. Certainly of those, the vast majority, 98%, use a car as their mode of transportation, while a decent amount, 20% at least, walk some of the time. So people could check multiple options for this. But almost everybody, 98%, uses a car, and then about 20% also walk, and about 10% bicycle or scooter. And so when we ask that same question in a different way, is there another form of transportation that you don't currently use that you would like to? About 60% said they only want to use their car. That's a pretty big decrease from the 98%, right? And then we had about 20% each saying they'd like to be able to walk or bike. And then a little over 10% saying they'd like to be able to use public transit. So we're certainly not going to, get rid of cars on Mission Street by any stretch. There is interest among our survey respondents in providing some additional options within reasonable on the street. When we ask about safety and access along Mission Street, just under 50% of our responses were very unsatisfied with getting into or out of destinations, compared to about 30% that were very satisfied or satisfied. So in other words, about half of our respondents don't feel great about getting into and around on Mission Street, compared to about 30% that feel okay with it. If we think about that, breaking it down versus roadway versus on the sidewalk, our numbers are pretty similar, are dissimilar. So about 40% feel unsafe on Mission Street on the road, compared to a similar number, 37%, that feel safe. When we talk about then being on the sidewalk, that number changes a little bit. About 40% of respondents feel unsafe on the sidewalk, compared to 27% that felt safe. We asked folks to pick one word that would describe the current state of Mission Street. I don't think any of this is necessarily a surprise to us, but busy comes up as the number one by far. We also see some positive things here, like business, good. And then some negative things, chaotic, scary, ugly, fast. So again, back to our sort of overwhelming theme about safety. And then we asked people to pick one word that would describe their ideal future state. And our number one word is safe. Again, by kind of a long shot, but you can see again other common words here that come up, like convenient, accessible, calm, efficient, attractive. Having traffic, like traffic is another one, right? So again, we want to balance that need to provide more safety and more access with maintaining traffic levels that support our businesses and uses along the corridor. We asked folks to prioritize features to add to the corridor or to improve on a scale of very important to not very important. And so these are the features that got scored as being very or somewhat important to add to the corridor. The first was street lighting, and that was kind of a surprise to us. It wasn't necessarily that we thought lighting was something that's an issue, but it's something that we're going to look at in more detail based on the survey response to be sure that lighting is adequate, or that we're providing lighting that works for different users, and maybe also in locations that maybe aren't on the roadway, but just off the roadway. Enhancing crosswalks was next, along with maintaining a left turn median as it is today, wider sidewalks, street trees and landscaping, accessibility features, etc. You can see that the improvement that was sort of least commonly picked as being important were adding roundabouts. So overall, when we take all of this together and kind of think about it from our perspective in working through this project with you all in the corridor, we have a few themes that have come to the top. The first is safety, right? We've talked about this multiple times. Safety is our top concern. The second, and this is really critical because this isn't true across the state, is that you all there within your region have a very willing and collaborative partner in the state DOT. Your local MDOT region has been working with the city on Mission Street for a long time and is very willing to think about creative solutions to the problems that we face in the corridor. We can't emphasize enough how important that is. There's generally a strong desire for improvement. I think the community wants to see change, but with the understanding that we have to balance that change between that sort of vision for the future and their current constraints. There are opportunities to make improvements, but it's really not a corridor-wide approach. It's more thinking about that on a block-by-block basis and giving some nuance to what the right approaches are in given areas of the corridor, because they're not going to be the same, right? We talked about the difference in right-of-way between south and north, but also just the different contexts in different parts of the corridor. Enhancing connections to destinations is really important. So thinking about how to go to places, not through the area. So thinking beyond just the corridor, but how do you get east to west? And if you're using the corridor, how do you get to those destinations, those places that people want to make trips to in a safe and effective manner? It's not just going north and south, but traversing the whole corridor and making connections through. And then lastly, Mount Pleasant has tools and opportunities to make significant change. The city's already doing some great things and thinking about creative ways to use funding through local resources like the Mission Pickard DDA to encourage property owners to close driveways or improve facades. And so that work's not waiting for us to get done. It's happening today, and those programs are available. And so whenever we do this, we have to think about how do we kind of take that phased approach one step at a time and not jumping too far ahead. So our next steps in this work, now that we've completed the analysis of the corridor, we'll be working over the summer on conceptual designs and policy options with city staff and MDOT staff to then present all of those back to you at the steering committee at the end of the summer in August or early September. And then once those designs are presented to you all and we feel like we're headed in the right direction, we'll hold a public input and engagement event in September where we present those concepts to the public and community as a whole and get broad-based feedback on them and have opportunities to kind of refine those things and make improvements and tweaks based on what we hear from the community. So with that, we can pause and take our moment for public comment or answer any additional questions or discuss any other items anyone would like to talk through.
Jason, this is Jeff Smith. During the earlier meeting, you asked the question of what's our favorite street in the state of the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
What were the results of that? Do you have pictures of any of those?
We didn't get a ton of responses on that question during the meeting. We could recirculate that question maybe to you as a steering committee just in an email, and then we could give you a better summary of that, Jeff.
All right. And then another thing I just want to touch on, in your introduction, you talked about the master plan and you showed the image from that.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to be clear that was just an image. It was not our vision.
Right.
I mean, we're not trying to duplicate that. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, that was the vision that's included in the plan. And I think that's the source of some of the sort of consternation about that plan and how it relates to Mission Street, because I think that vision, that image in the plan is a little bit misleading. It shows a ton of change.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we're necessarily at the point where we see that level of change over the next 25 years, and certainly not all at once. And so as we do this update, I expect that picture will change or go away.
Right. Okay, good. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions or comments from anybody?
Yeah, Jason, Brandon LaBelle here. Appreciate your presentation and all the effort and time you put into it. One concern of mine is I hear a lot about reducing the traffic on, let's just say, Mission Street. Our company does a lot of commercial sales and leasing. For example, if businesses want to decide to come to Mount Pleasant, A lot of these folks have research departments that are specifically looking at car counts. And it's concerning to see that decrease. I understand with population decrease, you're going to have a decrease in traffic on Mission Street, but I can't highlight how important it is that we still want traffic on Mission Street, right? If we don't have traffic, whether it's pedestrian, car, bike, however, we lose interest from potential businesses coming to Mount Pleasant, want to open up in Mount Pleasant and fill some of the vacant properties we have. So just when you're going through all this and reviewing it, I'd just like you to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and Brandon, we heard you all loud and clear at the first steering committee meeting about that. So if that didn't come through in this, we'll try to do a better job of that. I think what we took out of that is a need to balance those things, right? So we want to make Mission Street safer with the idea that we don't want to discourage people from using it. And so trying to find ways to balance that need to maintain traffic and access with safety. So, I mean, certainly I don't think we have any desires to try to reduce vehicle counts. That's not, I think, part of our work that we're trying to do.
Wonderful. Thank you.
For sure.
Hi, this is Christine Ortman. I was just going to kind of add on to what Brandon was saying. I think we were even looking at what we could do to improve the safety and safe flow of traffic, because we had a lot of significant feedback that people avoid even driving down Mission.
Yeah.
Because of trying to avoid all the chaos and busyness. So by improving the traffic flow and safety, we hope to increase the traffic counts and bring people to those businesses. So.
Thanks, Christine. I think Matt, as a traffic engineer, can speak to this too, right? That speed and traffic counts aren't the same thing. And so if we look at ways to make that safer and provide more access, our counts may go up, even though maybe speeds or other things may gradually decline, or we may see changes in traffic patterns.
Yeah, so to Jason's point, again, what we're not trying to do is choke off Mission to anyone that's using it, whether they're driving, walking, biking, whatever. Generally speaking, we're trying to help address some of the variations in speed that lead to negative safety outcomes on streets like this. So when you have people slowing down to turn, in a car all over the place, when you have people speeding up to turn out all over the place, generally speaking, if someone's, slowing down to turn, accelerating the turn in, and someone else is driving through at 45, 50 miles an hour, that's when crashes happen. What we're trying to do is kind of streamline, channelize the traffic flow, better basically tighten up the speed range of cars that are on there, and then pushing access to more controlled points. That is kind of a proven safety feature or element for vehicles especially. And so, yeah, again, what we're not trying to do is choke it off, just trying to channelize, streamline, and align speeds. Because when we see differentials in speed, that's when we have essentially poor safety outcomes.
Hey, one more question. Talking about speeds, have we talked to MDOT about if they're willing to reduce the speed limit? If that's what we're trying to do, I know I've been involved in some of these roundtables and discussion with past administrations at the city. And one of the comments that was made on why they want to move the buildings closer to the road is so it makes people slow down, which it baffled me to hear that. Seems like we could, if we're trying to get traffic to slow down on Mission Street for safety purposes, are they open to reducing that speed limit in certain sections of Mission Street?
So,
go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a conversation that will need to be explored as we get into design. Just high level speed limit setting is a very chicken and egg thing. So generally speaking, the state law does not permit reductions in speed limit just arbitrarily. They would go out, measure the existing speeds, along a road or along a certain segment, and then modify the speed limit based on what's happening now. So what that means is there are certain design elements you could incorporate, and whether that's landscaping, whether that's, again, decreasing what we call the setback, the distance between the road and the building, tightening travel lanes, there are things that we can do to reduce vehicle speeds. And then we could go out and measure and then try and work towards a slower speed limit if that is the goal. However, the speed limit set as it is today also kind of hinders the possibility of certain types of those elements being improved. So it's a very kind of nuanced and iterative thing. I think even if the steering committee wanted it, even if the state, said, hey, we also want a slower street, they by state law are not allowed to just go out there and change the sign to 25, 30, 35, whatever it would be. So yeah,
Thank you.
hopefully that's not, it's confusing, I guess is the short answer, and not quite as simple as just changing the sign. But I think that's certainly a conversation to be had.
Yeah, I think we do need to have it. I would imagine some of the businesses would probably appreciate a little slower traffic too. That's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah, I think there are lots of folks that wish that policy was different, but it is the world that we're in, unfortunately.
Jason,
Any other? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Mission as a corridor for freight, so truck access and all of that. I remember one of the results of the survey was that was not a priority in terms of who we should be designing the street for. And because that was one of the main reasons why the state had put such a wide boulevard that did not match the existing context. I wonder if you could just speak about that and what the survey resulted, and if I got it right.
Yeah, I think that wasn't a question that we included in our summary. Certainly, most of our survey responses, freight traffic, truck traffic was not a high priority for design. That being said, we still have to be sure that the businesses along Mission can get access for deliveries and those sorts of needs. But I think the previous plan, and Matt, you have the right terminology for me here, but the characteristic of that road has changed a little bit, and standards have changed a little bit that allow us to emphasize truck access less than it would have had to be emphasized back in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And so while that last design had lots of sort of right-of-way taken so trucks could make that big looping turning movement, we don't have to provide that same level of width for trucks to make that movement anymore because of new standards.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's awesome to hear.
We're basically at time. If anybody has any other questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to Manuela or anybody on our team. We're happy to connect with you all on it. Like I said, we'll be spending the rest of the summer doing some conceptual design work with city staff and MDOT. And then we'll look forward to seeing you all in August and September to look through that stuff together and continue to work through this process. I think, Manuel, this is recorded and will be available on the city's website as well, right?
Yes.
Great. So thanks everybody again. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We really appreciate all your support. For any of you that encouraged folks to do the survey, great job. We had really helpful responses on that. So we're super pleased with the results so far.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks again, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much.